Welcome to the channel. A woman stood at the end of a dirt road in rural Vermont with a suitcase so old the leather had cracked along every fold line and a belly so heavy she had to hold it with one hand just to keep walking. She had $11 in her coat pocket. She had no husband. She had no home. And the door she was about to knock on belonged to someone she hadn't spoken to in 4 years. What happened next didn't just save her life, it taught her something about belonging that most people never learn. If stories like this move you, take a moment and subscribe. It costs you nothing, but it means the world to this channel. Now let's begin. The afternoon was dying slow over the hills of Alder Creek, Vermont, like even the daylight was too tired to hold on. October had turned the sugar maples into fire red so deep they looked almost painful against the gray sky, but Elara Dunham wasn't looking at the trees. She was looking at the ground, counting steps, keeping her eyes on the next patch of dirt, because if she looked up, if she saw how far the road still stretched ahead, she wasn't sure her legs would keep moving. She'd gotten off the regional bus 2 curves back. The driver had glanced at her belly, then at her suitcase, then at the empty road. And for a second, she thought he might say something kind. He didn't. He closed the doors and pulled away, and the dust from the tires settled on her shoes like the day was already trying to bury her. The suitcase was brown, scuffed at the corners. One of the clasps didn't close right anymore, so she had wrapped a belt around it to keep it shut. It wasn't heavy, she didn't own enough for it to be heavy. But she carried it like it weighed everything she had left because in a way, it did. Every piece of clothing she still owned was inside. Every decision that had brought her here was latched behind that broken clasp. She was 27 years old, 8 months pregnant, and the man who had put that child inside her had not disappeared all at once. That would have been easier. A clean break, a door slammed shut, something she could hate and move past. But Kellan Briggs hadn't done that. He'd done something slower, crueler. He'd started pulling away one thread at a time, a text replied to 3 hours late, then 6, then not at all. A phone call that used to last 40 minutes, shrinking to 8, then 2, then a voicemail. She stopped leaving. He didn't walk out. He evaporated. And by the time Elara finally understood she was alone, the absence had been there so long, it had already grown furniture and moved in. She went to her father's house. Not because she expected warmth, her mother had died 5 years before, and with her had gone the only voice in that house that ever knew how to make hard things softer. But because she had nowhere else and the baby was coming, and she thought that might matter enough to unlock a door. Her father listened. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't call her names or throw things. He sat at the kitchen table with both hands around a coffee mug. And he told her in a voice as flat as the table between them that he couldn't have her staying there. Not in her condition. Not without a marriage that explained things to the neighbors. Not without a plan that looked like something other than a mess. She didn't argue. She had never been the kind of woman who fought back with volume. She just nodded, stood up, closed the suitcase she hadn't even fully opened, and walked out into a world that suddenly felt like it had run out of doors. That was 6 days ago. She'd slept in a bus station in Albany. She'd eaten from a vending machine in Springfield. She'd called 2 friends who both said the same thing, a long pause, a careful voice, the word complicated, used like a lock. And now she was here on a road she barely remembered walking toward the one person she hadn't yet asked, because asking meant admitting she had truly, completely run out of everywhere else. The dairy farm appeared at the top of the next hill, like something painted by a man who still believed in simple things. White clapboard farmhouse with a porch that sagged, just enough to look honest. Red barn behind it, the paint faded to the color of dried blood. A stone wall running along the pasture, each rock placed by hand, probably 100 years ago, by someone who understood that the best fences were the ones you built yourself. Smoke rising thin and straight from the chimney. A row of rubber boots by the door. A gray cat watching from the windowsill with the calm superiority of something that had never once been asked to leave. Elara stopped at the gate. She put the suitcase down. She pressed both hands against the small of her back. and breathed not a deep breath, not a cleansing breath, just the kind of breath a person takes when they need one more minute before they find out if the world still has room for them. The smell reached her first. Warm milk, wood smoke. Something baking bread maybe, or biscuits, and underneath it all, that earthy Vermont autumn scent of wet leaves and cold stone and grass that was starting to give up for the year. It smelled like a place where people still did things by hand, where the day had a rhythm that didn't depend on anyone's approval. She picked up the suitcase, straightened her back as much as 8 months of baby would allow, and walked to the door. The knock sounded small against the wood. From inside, footsteps, firm, unhurried. The kind of walk that belongs to a woman who has done 10,000 things today and will do 10,000 more and doesn't need to rush any of them. The door opened, and there was Margit Sorrel, 64 years old, silver hair cut blunt at the jaw, shoulders squared like the stone walls outside, not aggressive, just permanent. She wore a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and a dish towel over one shoulder, and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, which meant she'd been doing something that required both her hands and her mind, and she'd stopped doing it to answer the door, and she was already measuring whether the interruption was worth the pause. Her eyes moved in order. Face first, recognition slow and careful, like opening a drawer she hadn't touched in years. Then the suitcase, then the belly round and undeniable under Elara's coat. The silence lasted 3 full seconds. Elara's throat tightened, but she spoke anyway with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this sentence for 6 days and still wasn't sure it would come out whole. Aunt Margit, I know I'm showing up without calling. I'm not here to make trouble. I just need a quiet place to stay for a little while. Until the baby comes. If you can't do it, I'll understand. Margit didn't answer right away. It wasn't a cold silence. It was the silence of a woman who looked carefully before she spoke, because she'd learned a long time ago that careless words were harder to take back than careless actions. Then she stepped to one side and opened the door wider. Come in first. Some things think better when you're not standing in the cold. The sentence was so ordinary, so plain, that it nearly broke Elara apart. She lowered her eyes for just a moment, nodded, took a step forward. But before she crossed the threshold, Margit turned her head toward the back of the house and called out, voice steady, volume unchanged. Thatch, come here a minute. From the far end of the hallway came the sound of a chair pushing back. Then footsteps different from Margit's. Longer stride, quieter landing. A man appeared in the doorframe at the end of the corridor. 35 maybe. Brown hair that needed cutting. Hands that were already dry but still carried the memory of grease and rope and soil in the lines of the knuckles. He moved the way certain men move when they've learned that in some moments, even the way you walk can either comfort someone or hurt them slowly without weight. Like he was trying not to take up more space than necessary. This was Thatcher Penrose. He'd been living on the farm for 6 years, after his own life had come apart in a way he didn't talk about and nobody asked. Margit had given him a room and a job, and he had responded by staying, by caring for every corner of the property with the kind of loyalty that never announces itself. He wasn't family. He wasn't hired help exactly. He was something the English language doesn't have a clean word for, someone who belongs to a place because the place would feel wrong without him. He looked at Elara, not with curiosity, not with surprise, just with a quiet attention that took in the suitcase and the belly and the exhaustion on her face, and decided without drama that the right thing to do was the simplest thing. I'll take that inside for you. Sit down first if you need to. Elara blinked. Thank you. He reached for the suitcase. His hand closed around the handle gently. Not the way someone grabs luggage, but the way someone picks up something they understand matters to the person who's carrying it. He lifted it without effort, turned and walked it down the hallway without asking where it should go, as if he already knew that the spare room at the end of the house had been waiting for exactly this. Elara watched him go. She didn't know this man. She remembered him vaguely from years ago, a quiet figure in the background of a visit she'd made when she was 22 and the world still seemed like it would work out. But standing here now with her body aching and her dignity held together by nothing but habit, she had the immediate feeling that he was one of those people who knew how to be near without pushing. Margit touched her elbow, just barely. The way you guide someone who can still walk but might not know which direction to go. You must be tired. Come sit. Everything else can wait. The kitchen swallowed Elara whole. Not with size, it was small, actually, the way Vermont kitchens are, but with warmth. The wood stove in the corner threw heat that reached every wall. On the counter, a pot of soup, the lid slightly off steam, curling toward the ceiling. A loaf of bread on a board cut halfway, the inside still pale and soft. A jar of honey with a wooden dipper resting across the top. Milk in a ceramic pitcher still warm enough that condensation beaded on the outside. The table was scrubbed pine, clean, set for two, which meant Margit had been about to eat dinner with Thatch. And now there would be three, and neither of them had made that feel like an imposition. Margit pulled a bowl from the shelf, ladled soup without asking, tore bread without ceremony, and set it in front of Elara with the matter-of-fact grace of a woman who understood that feeding someone was not a favor. It was just what you did when a person showed up hungry. Eat first. The body needs peace before words. Elara obeyed. The soup was simple root vegetables broth time, and so good it made her chest ache. Not because of the flavor, though the flavor was fine. Because of what it meant to have someone place food in front of her without making her feel like a burden. Every small gesture of that meal. The bread pushed closer, the water glass refilled before it was empty. The silence that asked for nothing seemed to give back a small piece of air she'd been missing for weeks. Thatch came in once during the meal. He set a folded blanket on the chair nearest the stove and a glass of water beside it, then left without a word. No questions, no lingering. Just a man who understood that certain nights what a person needed most was proof that someone had thought about them without being asked. After the meal, Margit led her to the small room at the back of the house. The bed was made. The window was cracked open so the air moved, because Margit knew that a closed room felt like a closed fist to someone who had been running. The suitcase was already there, resting at the foot of the bed, placed upright and careful, the way Thatch did everything. It's not big, but it's clean and it's yours for now. Elara touched the quilt with her fingertips. Blue and white, hand-stitched. Worn soft by years of actual use, not decoration. It's more than enough, Aunt Margit. It's more than enough. Margit studied her for 1 second longer than necessary. Then she said with that dry warmth that was starting to feel like the woman's signature, firm on the outside, careful on the inside, and never once sentimental. You don't have to settle for enough when you show up exhausted. The important thing is that tonight you sleep. Elara nodded. She didn't cry. But when Margit left and closed the door softly behind her, and the last sounds of the kitchen drifted down the hallway, a dish being put away, a faucet running briefly, the wood stove door creaking shut. Elara understood that what was moving her most wasn't the room or the bed or the soup. It was that no one had made her justify her pain. She sat on the edge of the mattress and looked down at the suitcase. It sat there like a sentence she hadn't finished. Still buckled, still belted shut. She could have opened it, could have hung her coat, put away her things, arranged the few baby clothes she'd folded inside with the kind of care people give to things they're afraid to hope for. She didn't. She left it closed, because opening it meant she was staying, and staying meant trusting that this door would remain open. And she wasn't ready to trust that. Not yet. Not tonight. She turned off the lamp, lay down on her side with one hand beneath the pillow and the other resting on her belly, and listened to the farm settle into darkness around her. The barn creaking the wind against the stone wall. A cow shifting its weight somewhere out there in the cold. And underneath all of it, the deep, steady quiet of a place that had stood through winters much worse than this one, and would stand through this one too. The next morning she woke before anyone called her. Habit. The kind of early rising that doesn't come from discipline, but from months of sleeping in places where staying asleep too long meant someone might tell you to move. The farm was already alive. Wood smoke, bucket handles clanking, the rhythmic sound of something being poured. Margit's boots on the porch boards. Elara, dressed quickly, splashed water on her face from the basin on the dresser and went to find her aunt in the kitchen. Margit was arranging jars on a shelf, her back turned, her movements precise and unhurried. Aunt Margit, I don't want to sit here doing nothing. If there's anything I can help with, I'd like to. Margit finished placing the last jar before she answered. Everyone here does what they can. That's all anyone needs to do. She nodded toward the work table. Sorting eggs, wiping down bottles, cutting dried herbs, folding cheesecloth. They were small tasks, but Margit gave them to her with the naturalness of someone who was not offering charity. She was offering a place inside the rhythm of the day. Elara understood immediately. Her aunt wasn't treating her as a disaster to be tolerated for a few weeks. She was giving her a seat in the pattern of the house. Thatch passed through the kitchen a while later, carrying a crate of supplies. He saw Elara standing at the table, noticed she'd been on her feet too long, and without breaking stride, set a wooden stool beside her. Sit when you need to. You don't have to prove your strength every hour. Elara almost smiled. I don't want to be useless. He shook his head once gently. Resting doesn't make anyone useless. She looked at him for a second, surprised by the plainness of a truth she hadn't been able to name. Then she sat. And for the rest of the morning she worked in a silence that no longer felt borrowed. It wasn't home yet, it wasn't belonging yet. But it was something she'd missed for too long, the possibility of being in a place without apologizing for existing. 3 days in, Margit asked her to carry a pail of feed scraps to the goat pen behind the barn. Leave it by the fence. And don't trust Duchess. Elara didn't get a chance to ask who Duchess was. The moment she unlatched the pen gate, a large alpine doe, gray and white, with amber eyes full of ancient grievance, charged straight at her, with the force and conviction of a creature who had decided without evidence that this stranger was here to steal something. The pail went sideways, feed scattered across the mud. Elara stumbled back 2 steps, 3, her hand flying to her belly out of reflex, her other arm raised uselessly against a goat who weighed 60 pounds and acted like she owned every ounce of the world. Thatch appeared from beside the barn before the situation got worse. He stepped between Elara and Duchess with a calm that suggested he'd done this before, probably weekly, and redirected the goat with one firm hand on her flank. Duchess retreated with the deeply offended posture of someone who had been wronged by everyone present and would be keeping a record. Elara pressed a hand to her chest, breathing hard. She declared war on me and I haven't been here a week. Thatch's mouth moved in a way that was almost a smile but never quite arrived. It's not personal. She just likes reminding everyone who's really in charge around here. From the porch, Margit appeared with her arms crossed and her dish towel over one shoulder, surveying the wreckage of scattered feed and wounded dignity with the unhurried calm of a woman who had seen this exact scene play out with every new person who set foot near that pen. If you survive, Duchess, you're halfway through the initiation. Elara laughed. It came out short, surprised, clean, not the kind of laugh that covers pain, but the kind that rises when something absurd happens. And for once, the absurdity doesn't end in shame. It just ends in someone else shrugging and saying, well, that's Duchess. The incident floated through the rest of the morning like a small shared secret. Something light. Something that made the air between the 3 of them a little easier to breathe. Later, while Margit was warming milk with cinnamon and turning bread on the skillet, the baby kicked hard. Elara paused, one hand on the countertop, the other pressed flat against the swell of her belly, where the movement was strongest. The kick came again, sharp and insistent, like a fist knocking on a wall. He's at it again, she murmured. Margit looked over without turning fully. That child hasn't been born and he already wants to run the schedule. Thatch, who was stacking a crate by the door, glanced at Elara's belly when he saw the fabric of her shirt shift. Sounds like he knows exactly when food comes out. Margit gave a short breath through her nose, the closest thing she ever came to laughing out loud. He'll come out a Foreman, Mark my word. Elara lifted her eyes. A foreman. Of course. Margit said as if it were the most self-evident thing in the world. He's not even here yet, and he's already demanding things get done on his time. Thatch nodded with a seriousness that was almost certainly not serious. Best to keep him happy now. Get on his good side early. Elara smiled without realizing it. The nickname settled into the kitchen the way good bread settles into a house without ceremony, without effort, just suddenly part of the air. The foreman. From that moment on, every time the baby kicked during a meal, or Elara mentioned she was hungry again, Margit would say it. Give the foreman something before he starts issuing orders. Or, that child is going to walk out of you with a clipboard. And each time said between wooden spoons and steam, and the plain business of a kitchen that never stopped working. Something inside Elara shifted a little further from the edge. This was the thing she hadn't expected. Not the room, not the food, not even the safety. What she hadn't expected was that someone would talk about her baby not as a problem, not as a consequence, not as proof that she'd made a mistake. The world would never let her forget, but as a person, a small, unborn, opinionated person who already had a name in this house, even if it was a joke. And that joke was more tender than anything anyone had called him before. That afternoon, Elara sat on the porch in a wooden chair that she was certain hadn't been there the day before. The wind moved through the valley below, bending the last of the tall grass, before winter flattened it for good. From where she sat, she could see the stone wall, the pasture, the barn door half open, and Thatch near the fence line repairing a hinge on the gate. He worked the way he did everything without hurry, without waste, with a concentration that seemed built into his hands rather than something he had to try for. She watched him for just a moment longer than she meant to. The light was going amber. The air smelled like hay and cold stone and the faint, far-off sweetness of maple. Duchess was standing at the far end of the pen, staring at Elara with the fixed disapproval of a creature who had not yet decided whether to forgive and probably never would. Elara rested one hand on her belly. The foreman was quiet now. Sleeping, maybe. Or just listening. She had come here thinking she was asking for shelter. A temporary corner where she could wait out the last weeks of pregnancy without being thrown back into the open. But that afternoon, sitting in a chair someone had placed in the right spot without being asked. Watching a man fix a gate with the patience of someone who believed small things deserved the same care as large ones. Listening to her aunt inside the kitchen talking to a cat about the correct temperature for cheese that afternoon. The farm began to feel like something other than a place she was passing through. She wasn't ready to call it home. Not yet. The suitcase was still closed at the foot of her bed, buckled and belted, keeping everything she owned packed tight against the possibility that this too might end. That this door, like every other, might eventually close. But for the first time in longer than she could measure, Elara did not feel like she was taking up space that someone else would rather have back. And in a life that had spent the last year shrinking her down to fit inside other people's comfort, that was not a small thing. That night, after the kitchen had gone dark, and the farm had folded itself into the particular silence of a place where the work is done and the animals are fed, and the cold is outside where it belongs. Elara lay in bed and listened. Wind against stone, a branch tapping the window like a polite visitor, the low, distant lowing of a cow settling in for the night. And somewhere beneath all of it, so faint, she might have imagined it the sound of a door being checked, one last time, latched, tested, made sure by someone who didn't sleep until the house was secure. She put her hand on her belly. The foreman turned once slowly and was still. Tomorrow there would be more work. More eggs to sort, more cloth to fold, more Duchess to survive. Tomorrow Margit would say something dry and perfect that landed harder than any kindness wrapped in soft words. Tomorrow Thatch would fix something she didn't know was broken and never mention it. And tomorrow, the suitcase at the foot of her bed would still be closed. But tonight, just tonight, Elara let herself think for one careful second that maybe she didn't need to keep it packed quite so tight. Over the next several days, Elara began to notice things that nobody mentioned. The wooden chair on the porch, the one she'd sat in that first afternoon, kept moving. not dramatically, not across the house or into a different room. Just a few feet from one end of the porch to another, always appearing in whichever spot the afternoon shade fell longest. She never saw anyone carry it. She never heard it scrape across the boards. It simply was where she needed it, the way a good sentence is where you need it in a book, already there when you arrive. As if it had been waiting. The step at the front door changed too. She'd caught her foot on it the second night, a splinter of raised wood just enough to throw her balance at the worst possible angle for a woman whose center of gravity had moved 3 months ago and never come back. She'd grabbed the door frame, steadied herself, forgotten about it by morning. But 3 days later, stepping out with a dish towel over her shoulder, she felt the difference under her boot. Smooth, level. The grain sanded clean and sealed against the wet. She stood on it a moment longer than necessary, pressing down with her heel as if the wood could tell her something. She didn't need to look across the yard to know who had done it. Thatch was coiling a rope near the barn, his sleeves pushed past his elbows, the early light catching the side of his jaw. He didn't glance up. She didn't say anything. But she stood on that step a while longer, because sometimes a piece of repaired wood says something too large for a thing so small. There was also the matter of the gate latch on the goat pen, which no longer stuck. The loose board on the side of the chicken coop, which no longer rattled in the wind. The bucket she used for washing herbs, which had developed a crack along the bottom, and then overnight hadn't. None of these repairs were announced. None of them came with explanation or expectation. They just appeared in the margins of the day, quiet and steady, like footnotes written by someone who paid attention to the text, but never expected credit for the reading. One night, the 7th or 8th, she'd stopped counting. Elara couldn't sleep. The baby was restless, turning and pressing against her ribs in that slow, relentless way he had when neither of them could find a comfortable position. Hunger arrived without warning, not sharp but persistent, the kind that wouldn't let her pretend it wasn't there. She waited in bed, hoping it would pass. It didn't. She pulled the wool blanket around her shoulders and walked down the hallway toward the kitchen. The house was almost silent. Almost. The fire in the wood stove had burned down to a low glow, just enough to keep the room from going cold. The floorboards creaked twice under her feet. A clock she hadn't noticed before ticked from somewhere above the shelf. On the table, she found a slice of bread wrapped in a clean cloth and a mug of milk warmed with cinnamon. Not hot, the steam had gone, but still holding warmth the way a stone holds sun after the light moves on. She stopped. No note. No sign of who had been here. Just two things set out with a simplicity that reached deeper than any explanation could. She sat down, slowly unwrapped the bread, and ate in the dark kitchen, while the fire ticked and the house breathed around her. And somewhere outside, a barn owl called once and didn't call again. Each bite returned something to her that she hadn't known was missing. Not calories, not comfort exactly, but the knowledge that someone had thought of her hunger before she'd felt it, had placed this here and walked away without needing her to know. The next morning, she didn't ask who had left the food. She didn't need to. Margit was not a woman who left hidden tenderness on kitchen tables at midnight. The bread had been wrapped with a particular care. The cloth folded once, then tucked the way someone folds a thing they want to stay warm for as long as possible. And Elara had already begun to recognize that kind of attention in Thatch's hands. She said nothing. But later, when the coffee was ready, she poured a second mug and left it on the counter, where he always set down his gloves before heading out. She added sugar, not much, just enough to cut the bitterness. Because she'd watched him stir his own cup 3 mornings in a row and had counted the seconds his spoon stayed in the bowl. Thatch came in a few minutes later. He saw the mug, paused. "Is this for someone? Thought you might need it before heading out." He picked it up with both hands, the way people hold warm things when the morning is cold and the day is long. He looked at the coffee, then at her. "Thank you." One word. But the way he said it, slow, without excess, the consonants placed carefully like a man who didn't waste language, made it sound like it was holding more inside than the syllable could carry. Elara turned back to the dish towel she was folding, so he wouldn't see how much that single word had settled in her chest. The following Saturday, Margit decided it was time to go to the farmer's market in town. They had cheese to sell, small wheels of raw milk cheddar that Margit pressed in the cellar, each one stamped with a circle of cheesecloth, and a few jars of preserves from last month's apples. Elara helped load the truck, wrapping each wheel in wax paper, stacking the jars into a crate lined with straw. She didn't say it out loud, but a tension had been building in her body since Margit first mentioned the market. Since the day her belly became impossible to hide, other people's eyes had become a kind of weather she couldn't rest for. Not the open cruelty that was rare. Worse was the quiet inventory. The glance that moved from her face to her ring finger, to her belly, to the space beside her where a husband should be, and then back to her face with a smile that said, "I see everything you haven't explained." The market was held in a parking lot beside the Congregational Church, and it was exactly the kind of place where everyone knew exactly how much they didn't know about you and intended to find out. Folding tables under canopies, bushel baskets of late-season squash, jars of honey, bundles of dried lavender, knitted hats and hand-poured candles, and a man selling smoked trout from a cooler and talking about the Red Sox to anyone who would listen. Women in fleece vests moved between tables with canvas bags and conversations that never quite ended and never quite stayed private. Elara felt the looks before she heard the words. A woman with short grey hair and a clipboard glanced at her belly, then at Margit, then at the truck, performing a calculation that was none of her business, but that she would complete anyway. Two women near the bread table leaned toward each other, without leaning a motion so practiced it was nearly invisible. A man selling cider looked at Elara's left hand, and then looked away with the studied casualness of someone pretending he hadn't. The questions came dressed in kindness. "Almost due, huh? Your carrying low must be a boy. Staying with Margit for a while. That's nice. Good to have family. And are you? Is the father? I mean, is someone coming up for the birth?" Elara answered each one with a politeness that cost her more than they would ever know. Short replies, steady eyes, hands busy arranging cheese on the table. She kept her back straight because she had learned that posture was sometimes the only armor a woman had. But the body knows what the face won't show. Her shoulders tightened, her jaw set. The baby pressed hard against her bladder, as if even he could feel the weight of being examined. Thatch had been unloading the last crate from the truck. He came around to the front of the table without making a scene. He didn't interrupt anyone. He didn't cross his arms or square his shoulders or do any of the things men do when they're trying to look protective. He simply moved to the space beside Elara, took the heavy crate from her hands, and stayed there close enough that his presence was felt, far enough that it wasn't a statement. Just a man standing where he was needed, doing what came next. A woman with a voice pitched for carrying leaned across the table. "And the father, is he in the picture?" Before Elara could find an answer that wouldn't cost her something, Thatch lifted a wheel of cheese from the display and turned to Margit. "These go stacked or flat?" The question had nothing to do with the one that had just been asked, and everything to do with building a door that Elara could walk through without having to break anything down. Margit understood instantly. "Stacked. And if anyone wants to know more than what's on this table, they can start by buying something." The woman gave a short laugh that had no real amusement in it and moved on. There was no confrontation, no raised voice, no defending speech, just a question about cheese at exactly the right moment, and a woman who knew that the best way to shut a door was to act like it had never been open. Elara kept working the table, but inside her ribs, behind the tension and the tiredness, she felt the particular relief of a person who has been shielded without being made into a scene. Thatch hadn't rescued her. He'd just made sure she didn't have to stand alone in someone else's crosshairs. On the ride home, the truck rattled over the dirt road with half the cheese sold and all of the preserves gone. The three of them sat in the cab, Margit driving, Elara in the middle, Thatch by the passenger window, and the silence between them was the kind that doesn't need filling. It had texture and warmth like a quilt made of hours spent in the same room doing different things. Margit spoke first. Other people's mouths never close. But dinner does have a time. Better to pay attention to what actually feeds you. Elara looked at her, smiled with damp eyes. Margit turned onto the farm road as if she hadn't just said something enormous. When they pulled up to the house, Thatch took the empty crates from the truck bed and paused beside Elara as she climbed down from the cab. "You all right?" She shook her head slightly, not a denial, an assessment. Less tired than before. He watched her for a moment with that steady attention that never crossed into intrusion. Then the day wasn't so bad. She followed Margit inside, but in the hallway she stopped and turned to look back through the screen door. Thatch was carrying the last crate toward the barn, the late sun behind him, turning his shape into something quiet and reliable, and exactly where it ought to be. She thought about the bread wrapped in cloth, the coffee left on the counter, the way he'd placed himself beside her at the market without asking, without insisting, without leaving. She didn't have a name for that kind of care yet. But she was beginning to understand that there were people whose goodness didn't need to announce itself to stay with you all day. That understanding changed something. Not all at once, not dramatically. But in the days that followed, Elara started noticing that inside the rhythm of the farm, there was a presence that had become part of her days, in a way she couldn't ignore anymore. If a milk pail was too full, Thatch appeared before she reached for it. If the wind picked up in the yard, he'd already moved the lightest things and cleared the path she'd need to walk. If a fence post loosened by the time she looked again, it was solid. He never made his care into a performance. He just kept making the day a little easier around her edges, the way a riverbank shapes itself to water. Not fighting, not forcing, just adjusting, so the current can pass without breaking. One morning, while Margit was pressing a new batch of cheese, Elara reached for a heavy crate of jars to clear space on the work table. She lifted it an inch and felt the pull seize her lower back like a hand grabbing the base of her spine. She set the crate down immediately. Thatch was already crossing from the doorway. "I've got that. I was just trying to move it out of the way." He lifted the crate with one arm and set it in the far corner. "You're already carrying the foreman full time. That's plenty." From the table, Margit didn't look up. "And the foreman doesn't help. He just supervises." Elara smiled. She'd grown used to the name. And every time they said it, the weight of shame shrank a little more, and the warmth of a shared expectation grew. Another afternoon, she was hanging cheesecloth to dry on the line behind the house, when a gust of wind caught the rope and yanked it sideways. The sudden jerk spun her off balance, and for one bad second, she felt her weight shift too far forward. Thatch was there from the side of the barn, before she'd finished reaching for the post. One hand steadied the rope, the other retied the knot that had come loose. "That wind doesn't warn you." "I didn't see it coming either. That's why you leave it less to catch." The sentence was about a rope, but it sat in the air the way certain sentences do when they're about more than what they describe. 2 days before the end of October, Elara went into the small storage room beside the barn to find cloth for covering new jars. The space smelled of wood shavings and linseed oil, and the clean dust of things that still had use in them, but hadn't been needed in a while. She moved a box of lids, stepped past a folded tarp, and then she saw it. In the back beside the workbench, several boards of maple had been sanded smooth and laid out in order. A small hammer, nails sorted by size into a tin lid, and a structure not finished but far enough along that its shape was unmistakable. A cradle. The joints were tight, the curves were gentle. The edges had been sanded and sanded again, not just smooth but soft. The kind of soft that comes from someone who keeps running their hand over the wood, because they're imagining smaller hands touching it. Each piece looked like it had been measured, not just for function, but for feeling as if the person building it understood that a cradle is not furniture. It's the first place in the world a child is set down and told without words that there is space for them here. Thatch was bent over one side panel with a piece of fine grit sandpaper, his back to the door. He hadn't heard her come in. His hands moved in slow, even strokes, the same patience he brought to every gate hinge and fence rail and porch step. Except here, the patience had a different quality. Here, it looked like devotion. Elara didn't speak right away. She stood in the doorway and let the scene reach her fully. Until this moment, some part of her had still been living, as if she and the baby were temporary, guests waiting for a departure date that hadn't been set. But this cradle didn't speak of passing through. It spoke of staying, of someone who was already making room for a life that hadn't arrived yet and treating that arrival as certain. Thatch turned, saw her, straightened slowly, the sandpaper still in his hand. For a second, he seemed ready to explain, to offer a reason that was smaller than the truth. Then he decided not to. Still needs work. She stepped closer. Her fingers found the top rail of the side he'd already finished. The wood was warm under her touch, from his hands, from the sanding, from the hours he'd spent here that she hadn't known about. It's beautiful. He looked down at the cradle as if seeing it from her distance for the first time. I wanted to make sure there were no rough edges. You didn't have to do this. He met her eyes then with a directness that wasn't bold but wasn't shy either. It was the directness of a man who had decided to stop hiding what was obvious. Sometimes you build something because you can already see where it belongs. Elara wanted to tell him that no one had ever prepared a place for her child. That she came from rooms where she was always taking up too much space, too much air, too much time. That the smoothness of this wood was reaching a place inside her that still flinched when anyone got close. She wanted to tell him about the nights she'd lain awake in bus stations with her hand on her belly, wondering if her son would be born into a world that had already decided he was a mistake. She didn't say any of that. She just nodded slowly and whispered, "Thank you." And the word carried all of it anyway. Later, after she'd found the cloth she came for, after she'd walked back to the house with her arms full and her pulse altered, Margit looked up from the cheese press and studied her face for 2 seconds. "You look different." I went to the storeroom. Margit returned to cranking the press. She didn't ask what Elara had found there. She didn't need to. The answer was already sitting in the change around Elara's eyes, something that had been clenched for months, loosening by a fraction. That night, Elara did something she hadn't done before. She knelt beside the bed, unlatched the belt around the suitcase, and opened it. Not all the way, just enough to reach inside and pull out a small cotton onesie, pale yellow, folded so carefully it looked like origami. She held it for a moment. Then she set it on the bed beside her pillow. One piece of clothing, one small act of faith that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't temporary. The suitcase stayed open. She didn't close it back. She didn't put the onesie away in a drawer. She wasn't there yet. But she let it breathe. She let it exist outside the dark of a packed bag, in the light of a room that someone had prepared for her, and a cradle that someone was building without being asked. November arrived the way it does in Vermont, not with a single announcement, but with a slow total darkening. The light went earlier. The air went from cold to the kind of cold that lives inside your teeth. Frost crept up the windows each morning and had to be breathed away before you could see the yard. The cows stayed closer to the barn. Duchess stayed closer to the hay shed and glared at the weather as if it were a personal offense. Margit looked at the sky one morning while kneading dough. "Storm's coming, a real one." She said it the way she said everything, without drama, without worry, with the flat confidence of a woman who had seen 50 Vermont winters and understood that certain things were not argued with, only prepared for. Thatch spent the day outside. He checked the barn roof, secured the hay bales, stacked firewood against the back wall of the house until the pile was chest high. He tightened the shutters, tested the generator, brought the chickens into the lower barn, and moved Duchess and the rest of the herd into their winter pen with extra bedding. Every task completed with the same unhurried urgency. No panic, no wasted motion. Just a man closing every gap where trouble could enter. Elara watched him from the kitchen window while she dried jars. He climbed a short ladder to check the gutter above the porch. The wind was already pressing his shirt flat against his back, and stray flakes, the first scouts of whatever was coming, landed on his shoulders and melted before they could hold their shape. She watched him longer than she needed to, and she knew she was watching him longer than she needed to, and she did not look away. Margit's voice came from behind her. "That pot's not going to stir itself." Elara turned, just checking if the snow started. Margit raised one eyebrow, the one she used when she saw exactly what was happening, and had decided to let it happen without commentary. "Snow can wait. Your back can't always. Sit for a minute." The storm hit at dusk. It didn't build gradually. It arrived like a decision. One moment the yard was visible, the next it was white. The wind came from the north, driving snow sideways across the fields, whipping it against the windows in sheets so thick the barn disappeared entirely. The temperature dropped fast enough that the pipes made sounds they hadn't made all fall, a deep ticking, like the house was clenching its jaw. But inside everything held. The wood stove threw heat into every corner. The lamps were lit. Margit moved through the kitchen with the confidence of a woman who had weathered worse and would weather this and would not allow anything on her watch to go cold or dark or unaccounted for. Thatch came in from the final check with snow in his hair and his hands red. "Barn's locked, firewoods covered, generators set." Margit nodded. "And the cellar door bolted twice." He looked at Elara, who was sitting near the stove with both hands around a mug. "Everything okay?" "The foreman's restless tonight." "Storm does that, changes the pressure." He said it gently, as if he were talking about barometric science, but his eyes stayed on hers a beat longer than the sentence required, and in that beat was something that had nothing to do with weather. They ate dinner while the blizzard grew. Soup, bread, cheese. The fire crackled. The wind screamed. And between those two sounds, the small warm one and the large cold one, the kitchen felt like something carved out of the center of the world, a pocket of stillness that the storm could press against, but not enter. Elara went to bed early. The baby had been moving all evening. Not kicks exactly, but a low rolling restlessness, like he was rearranging himself for something. She lay on her side and listened to the house. Margit's footsteps in the kitchen, the stove door opening and closing. The wind constant now, like a voice that had forgotten it was yelling. She closed her eyes, opened them, closed them again. When the first real pain came, it wasn't a cramp. It wasn't the dull ache she had gotten used to in recent weeks. It was precise, deep, a line of fire drawn from her back to her pelvis that made her grip the edge of the mattress and press her face into the pillow. She held still, breathed, counted. It passed. She waited, hoped it was nothing. Told herself it was too early, 3 weeks too early at least, and the body sometimes practiced, sometimes rehearsed, sometimes lied. The second contraction came 7 minutes later. Harder, longer, and she knew it was not a rehearsal. She pushed herself upright, swung her legs over the side of the bed, pressed one hand against the wall and the other against her belly, and stood. The hallway was dim. The kitchen light was still on. Margit, as if she'd known this night was not a night for sleeping, was standing beside the stove with a pot of water already heating. When she saw Elara's face, she set down what she was holding immediately. "It started." Elara nodded. Words were expensive now. Margit crossed the room in 4 steps. She took Elara's arm not to support her weight, but to let her know that the arm was there and would not move. "Listen to me. Breathe. Don't rush ahead of your body. We go one step at a time." From the hallway came Thatch, fully dressed, alert, as though he had not been sleeping at all, or as though he had trained himself to wake at the exact frequency of a house that needed him. He looked at Elara, then at Margit, and understood everything, without a single word being wasted on explanation. "What do you need?" Margit answered while already guiding Elara back toward the bedroom. "Hot water, clean towels, the stack in the hall closet, all of them. More wood for the stove. Check that the lamp in the back room is full." "I'm on it." He moved. Not running, because running creates panic, and panic is contagious. and this house would not have panic in it tonight. He moved fast and even, and organized water on towels gathered, lamp-checked firewood stacked by the bedroom door, so nobody would have to leave the room to keep it warm. He tested the window latch. He set a clean bucket by the bed. He brought a second lantern and placed it on the dresser, so the light came from two directions and left no corner dark. Outside, the storm threw everything it had at the walls. Inside, the room became the only room in the world. Margit took control of the hours that followed with the steady precision of a woman who would not allow fear to set foot in her house. She adjusted pillows, she checked the water, she spoke just enough, not too much, not too little, and every word she chose was a brick laid between Elara and the terror. Your body knows this. It's done this for 10,000 years. Stay here with me. Elara gripped her hand when the next contraction bent her in half. She gasped. She squeezed her eyes shut. She made a sound she would have been ashamed of an hour ago, and Margit leaned closer and said, "Don't hide from me now. This isn't a time for making yourself small. Breathe. That's it. Just like that." Thatch waited outside the door. He came in only when called to bring water, to add wood to take away what needed taking away. Each time he entered, his eyes found Elara first, and each time there was something in them that he was holding carefully. Not pity, not worry exactly, but a ferocious tenderness that he carried the way he carried everything close to the body without display. The hours blurred. Pain became rhythm. Rhythm became surrender. And then, in a moment that split the night open like a window thrown wide in a closed room, a new sound entered the world. The cry of a child born in a snowstorm in a farmhouse at the end of a dirt road between hands that had not let go. Margit caught him with the hands that had milked 10,000 mornings and pressed 100 wheels of cheese and never once trembled when the work was hard. She wrapped him fast, clean cloth tight fold, the efficiency of a woman who understood that the first thing a newborn needs is not softness, but certainty, and brought him to Elara's chest before the cry had finished echoing off the walls. "Here he is. Look who came to really run things." Elara laughed. It came out broken, half sob, half sound, the kind of noise that belongs to a body that has just done the most violent and sacred thing it knows how to do. Her arms closed around the bundle. The baby was small and furious and alive, his face scrunched into an expression of profound displeasure at having been evicted from the only home he'd known, and his fists impossibly small, impossibly complete, clenched and unclenched against the cloth, like he was already reaching for something to hold on to. "My boy." The words came out so quietly, they barely made it past her lips. Margit adjusted the blanket with a tenderness she would never have shown in daylight. A brief, careful smoothing of fabric around the baby's shoulders, one finger tracing the edge of the cloth to make sure nothing pressed against his neck. "The worst part's done. Now you rest." From the doorway, Thatch stood with his back against the frame and his hands at his sides. He hadn't come in uninvited. He'd stayed exactly where the moment needed him, close enough to be reached, far enough to let the first minutes between mother and son remain unbroken. The lamplight caught his face, and what was there wasn't easy to name. Not joy exactly, not sorrow, something in between, the expression of a man who was watching a beginning and remembering an ending at the same time, and holding both without letting either one win. Elara raised her eyes to him. "Thatch." He stepped forward. One step, then another, slower, as if crossing a threshold that had nothing to do with the doorframe. "I'm here." 2 words, plain as bread. And they split her open again, not because they promised anything, but because they were true, and true was the thing she had gone longest without. Margit glanced at him sideways. "Well, if you're going to stand there like a fence post, you might as well come meet the foreman properly." He moved closer. Elara shifted the baby gently. "Do you want to hold him?" Something crossed his face, not reluctance, but a strange, raw caution. The caution of a man who knows exactly how much a small life weighs, because he has held one before and lost it. "I don't know if I'll do it right." Nobody starts out knowing. Margit's voice was dry as chalk. Put your hands out like you're not about to stack firewood. He reached. Elara placed the baby into his arms, and Thatch received him with a rigidity so complete, so earnest, so transparently terrified of doing harm, that Elara, exhausted, wrung out, still trembling from hours of labor, laughed. A real laugh. The kind that costs nothing and heals something. You're holding him like he's a crate of eggs. I'm trying not to break anything. Margit folded her arms. He's a baby, not a plank you just sanded. The baby squirmed once, let out a noise of mild protest, and then, against every expectation, went still. His fist uncurled against Thatch's collar. His breathing evened. He settled into the crook of Thatch's arm with the inexplicable trust of someone who has no reason to trust, and does it anyway. Thatch looked down. His jaw tightened once. His eyes stayed on the baby's face for a long time, and what moved through them was something he would not have been able to say out loud. Not then, maybe not ever. The feeling of holding new weight in the same arms that had once held a weight they couldn't keep. He didn't reject me. Margit's voice came softer than usual, almost. Give him time. He'll learn to make demands soon enough. The storm went on, but in that room lit by 2 lamps and heated by a fire that Thatch had fed all night, the sound of wind against the roof had changed. It was no longer a threat. It was just weather. And weather when you are warm and your child is breathing, and the people around you are not going anywhere, is only noise. The days after the birth rearranged the farm the way a new river rearranges a valley, not by force, but by the quiet insistence of something that will not stop flowing. Voices dropped lower when the baby slept. Water was always warm. Blankets appeared folded in places they hadn't been. The whole house seemed to lean inward, pulling its warmth tighter, as if the walls themselves understood that something new had arrived and needed protecting. Margit continued to run everything with the same iron rhythm. But Elara noticed her pausing by the cradle more often, not to fuss, not to adjust anything, just to stand there for 3 or 4 seconds and look the way a woman looks at bread rising in the oven, checking, confirming, then moving on. Thatch kept the outside world in order. Firewood fences animals' eyes scraped from the walkway each morning. But his path through the house had changed. Every time he came in from the cold, his eyes went to the cradle before they went anywhere else. And Elara, still sore, still tired, in that deep underwater way that follows birth, felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly. Not yet. But a pain that was different from all the others. A pain that came from having created something instead of having something taken away. On a Tuesday morning, clear and bitter cold, Margit set a notebook on the kitchen table and pushed it across to Elara. I've been thinking. Elara looked up from the baby nursing in her arms. We could do a small batch of apple ginger preserves for the market. Something different from what the other tables carry. And the cheese, if we cut smaller portions, wrap them better, more people buy. Not everyone has $6 for a whole wheel, but most people have $2 for a piece that looks like someone cared about it. Elara listened. The notebook had numbers in it, quantities, costs, a rough sketch of how the jars might be labeled. You want me to help? Margit closed the notebook, looked at her directly. I want you to make it. I'll be here. But I want your hands on it from start to finish, your eye on the sugar, your call on when it's done. Elara felt a flicker in her chest. I've never done a whole batch alone. I didn't ask if you've done it. I'm telling you that you can. The sentence had no cushion, no gentleness, and for that reason, it landed exactly where it needed to in the part of Elara that had spent a year being told in 100 different ways that she was not enough. Thatch came through the kitchen with a crate of fresh milk. He set it down, looked at the notebook, looked at Elara and said, It'll turn out well. He didn't smile. But something in his eyes was brighter than a smile. Not sympathy, not encouragement. Certainty. The kind of certainty that a person gives you when they are not trying to make you feel better. They're just telling you what they already know. Elara made the preserves that afternoon. Margit stood nearby, not hovering, not correcting, just present. She pointed out when the heat was too high. She suggested tasting the consistency before adding more sugar. But she let Elara stir, adjust, decide. The kitchen filled with the smell of cooked fruit and ginger, and something darker and warmer, underneath a sweetness that had a second layer, a slow heat that stayed after you swallowed. When the jars were sealed and cooling on the counter, Margit picked one up and turned it in the light. That's not bad. That's something a person would remember. Elara exhaled. She hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath since the first jar went into the water bath. The cheese came next, small portions cut, even wrapped in wax paper, with a fold Elara had figured out herself. A tuck at each corner that made the package look considered without being fussy. She lined them on a tray and stepped back. Margit studied the row. Looks like someone who knows what she's doing. Elara almost said, I don't, but stopped. Because that wasn't entirely true anymore. Market day was colder than last time. The parking lot by the church had frost on the asphalt, and the vendors wore double layers and stamped their feet between customers. Elara carried the preserves herself, one crate, not heavy, but hers in a way nothing she'd carried before had been. Thatch brought the cheese. Margit set up the table with her usual economy of motion. This time, and Elara stood at the front. She arranged the jars. She explained the flavor when people asked. She offered tastes on the edge of a wooden spoon and watched strangers close their eyes and nod and reach for their wallets. The preserves sold out before noon. The small cheese portions went faster than the large wheels ever had. A woman asked if there would be more next week. A man bought 3 jars and said he wanted to give them as Christmas gifts. Another woman, one who had leaned and whispered the last time Elara was here, came to the table, tasted the preserves, and bought 2 jars without asking a single question that wasn't about flavor. On the drive home, Margit reached into her coat and pulled out a small cloth pouch. She placed it in Elara's hand. Count it later. But that's yours. This is the farm's money. This came from your hands, from your recipe, from your judgment. The farm provided ingredients. You provided everything else. Elara looked at the pouch. It was light. The amount inside was small enough to matter, not enough to change anything material. But the weight of it in her palm was enormous because it was the first thing she had held in months that she had earned. Not been given, not allowed, earned. I don't know what to say. Margit turned back to the road. Don't say much. Just learn to recognize what's already yours. That evening, Kellan Briggs came back. He did not come alone. Elara saw the car first, clean, unfamiliar, parked at an angle by the gate, as if the driver had been in a hurry or simply didn't care about the ruts. Kellan stood beside it in a coat she'd never seen, and next to him was a man in a dark jacket carrying a leather folder, and the sight of that folder made something cold drop through Elara's stomach like a stone into a well. Kellan's voice was measured, practiced. I didn't come to fight Lara. I came because I have a right to be part of my son's life, and my attorney agrees. The man beside him opened the folder, began speaking in a voice calibrated for authority phrases about parental rights, about establishing paternity, about the court's preference for involvement of both biological parents, about the instability of Elara's current living situation. Elara felt her hands go cold, not from the weather, from the old fear, the one that lived in the bottom drawer of her chest, and whispered that everything good was temporary, that people who had more power would always come to collect, that the world was built for the ones who left, and came back when it suited them, not for the ones who stayed. But the fear lasted only a few seconds, because standing there with the pouch of market money still in her coat pocket, and the sound of her son sleeping inside the house she had helped keep warm, Elara discovered that the ground beneath her feet was harder than it used to be. You left before he was born. You left before I needed you most. You left before anyone in this house had to heat water. and hold my hand through a night you should have been here for. Kellan's attorney started to speak. Elara didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. I'm not denying you're his father by blood. But a father isn't someone who shows up with a lawyer when other people have already done the work of showing up without one. The attorney shifted the folder. Kellan's jaw tightened. Margit stepped onto the porch. She didn't shout. She didn't threaten. She stood there with her arms crossed and her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and looked at Kellan the way she looked at a fence that had been built wrong with patient total disapproval. I've known men like you my whole life. You don't come back for the child. You come back for the feeling of still mattering. But you don't get to matter here. Not after what you didn't do. She turned to the attorney. And you should know I've already spoken to Ruth Fenner at the County Family Law Office. She's a friend. She says your client's position is about as strong as wet paper in a rainstorm. So unless you've got something better than a folder and a bluff, I'd suggest you take the drive back while the roads are still clear. The attorney closed the folder. Kellan stood there for a moment longer, looking at the house, at the porch, at the light in the windows, at everything he had chosen to walk away from, and was now trying to reclaim through procedure. Then he got in the car. The engine started. The tires crunched on frozen gravel, and the car pulled away down the road and grew small, and then was gone. Elara watched until the taillights disappeared around the curve. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel anger. She felt something cleaner than either the specific lightness of a chest that has been bracing for impact for months and has finally been allowed to expand. That night, she opened every drawer in the dresser. She took every piece of clothing out of the suitcase, hers, the baby's, all of it, and placed each one where it belonged. Folded, stacked, arranged. The room changed around her as she worked. It stopped looking like a place where someone was sheltering and started looking like a place where someone lived. When the suitcase was empty, she held it open for a moment. The lining was worn. The corners were soft. It smelled faintly of bus stations and vending machine coffee and every temporary place she had slept in since the world had told her there was no room. She closed it, pushed it into the far corner of the room behind the dresser, where it rested against the wall and could not be seen from the bed. She straightened up. Her hands were shaking slightly. Not from cold. Thatch appeared in the doorway. He'd been passing or maybe not passing. Maybe just walking the hallway the way he walked it every night, checking that the house was settled and the people in it were safe. He saw the open drawers, the filled dresser, the empty corner where the suitcase used to sit at the foot of the bed like a held breath. He didn't speak for a long moment. Then quietly, "Looks different in here." Elara smoothed the front of her shirt. I figured it didn't make sense to keep everything packed. No, his voice was low. It doesn't. Not anymore. She looked at him. He looked back. And in the space between them, a space that had been narrowing for weeks, filled with repaired steps and midnight bread, and a cradle sanded smooth by hands that knew what it meant to build something for someone you weren't sure would stay, the unspoken thing finally surfaced. Lara. He said her name like he was setting it down carefully on a table. I know I wasn't part of your life from the start. I know you've carried more than anyone should carry alone. I'm not trying to confuse you. I'm not trying to push. He paused, breathed. But I can't keep acting like I'm just here to fix hinges and stack wood. I want to be here. Not for a season. Not until things settle. I want to be here when it's hard and when it's ordinary, and when the foreman wakes up at 3 in the morning, and someone needs to walk the floor with him. I want that to be me. Not because I think you need saving. I've watched you save yourself, and it's the most real thing I've ever seen. I'm asking because this farm doesn't make sense to me without you in it. And because I chose you a long time before I had the nerve to say it. Elara felt warmth fill her chest. Not the sharp heat of infatuation. Not the fragile warmth of a promise made too soon, but something steadier. The warmth of a wood stove that has been burning all night. The warmth of a house that holds. You were already here, she said. I think I was the one who needed time to believe it. From the kitchen, Margit's voice carried down the hallway with the unerring timing of a woman who had been listening to silence her entire life and knew exactly when it needed breaking. If you're both done standing there staring at each other, like the cheese presses itself, come eat. And bring the foreman. Nobody falls in love on an empty stomach in this house. Elara laughed. The sound filled the hallway clear open with nothing caught behind it. Thatch ducked his head, and the smile he'd been holding back all evening finally arrived quiet and full and permanent. She lifted the baby from the cradle. He stirred, once yawned, curled his fist around the collar of her shirt and settled. Thatch opened the door wider to let her pass. His hand hovered near her back, not touching just there, and the gesture was so small and so complete that it said everything a longer sentence would have ruined. At the top of the hallway, Elara paused and looked back into the room. The dresser was full. The cradle held a folded blanket waiting. The window showed the first pale light of a winter morning beginning to happen. And in the far corner, pushed against the wall where it could no longer be seen from the bed, the suitcase sat empty and still and finished. She turned and walked toward the kitchen where the light was warm and the coffee was already poured, and Margit was muttering something to the grey cat about the correct way to slice bread, and the whole house smelled of milk and wood smoke, and the particular sweetness of a life that was no longer waiting to be taken away. Outside, the snow from the storm had settled into soft, clean drifts across the yard. The stone wall wore a white line along its top, like a hem of lace. Duchess stood at the gate of the pen, watching the door of the farmhouse with an expression that could have been hostility or could have been patience, and for the first time did not lower her head to charge when Elara's shape appeared on the porch. The foreman made a small sound against his mother's shoulder. Not a cry, not a complaint, just a noise. The noise of a person who is new to the world and has decided without evidence that the world is acceptable. Elara held him closer. Sometimes the place where you belong is not the place where you started. It's the place where you finally stop keeping your bags packed by the bed. It's the place where someone fixes the step before you trip and leaves bread on the table before you're hungry and builds a cradle out of maple wood because they already see where it will go. It's not the place that takes you in. It's the place that makes you want to stay. And staying not because there's nowhere else to go, but because there is nowhere else you'd rather be, is the bravest thing a person can do after they've spent a long time learning how to leave. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. If it gave you even a small moment of warmth, I'm glad. Before you go, I want to ask you something simple, and I hope you'll leave your answer in the comments. When was the last time someone made you feel like you belonged, not with words, but with something they did? I'd love to hear your story. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Until then, may you always find a door that opens at the right time and someone on the other side who already set a place for you at the table.